When a millionaire came home early, he didn't walk into comfort, he walked into a nightmare, his wife kicking the maid's little black daughter. What happened next would not just shatter his marriage, but expose a secret the entire world had to see. The rain had just begun to tap against the tall windows of the mansion when Jonathan Rivers turned the key in the front door. It was earlier than usual. The board meeting had ended 2 hours ahead of schedule, and he had thought of surprising his family with a quiet Friday evening together. The house, usually humming with the faint noises of staff at work or Vivian's carefully curated music, seemed strangely silent. Jonathan stepped into the marble foyer, his shoes echoing softly across the polished floor. He paused. Then came the sharp rhythm of high heels striking against stone, followed by a crash so sudden and violent that it sliced through the silence like lightning. A porcelain vase, centuries old, had shattered against the wall. But that was not what froze Jonathan in his tracks. In the middle of the living room, just beyond the wide archway, his wife stood with her hands still raised, her body trembling with fury. At her feet, an 8-year-old girl lay crumpled in the corner, struggling to catch her breath. Lana. The maid's daughter. Jonathan's eyes locked on the child's small body, her thin hands gripping the rug as she tried to push herself up. A streak of blood ran down her knee where she had fallen, staining the expensive carpet. Her eyes, wide with terror, brimmed with tears as she looked up at Vivian, who towered over her like a predator over prey. "How many times have I told you," Vivian's voice hissed through clenched teeth, "not to touch my things, you useless brat." The words hung in the air, venomous and cold, carrying a cruelty Jonathan had never heard from her lips before. For 3 years of marriage, Vivian had been the embodiment of grace. At charity galas she was radiant, at dinner parties charming, always measured and flawless. Yet here, stripped of her mask, was a woman consumed by rage, lashing out at a child. Jonathan felt his hand tighten around the keys he still held, the metal biting into his palm. For a second, he wondered if this was real. Perhaps his mind was twisting the scene. But then Lana whimpered, a sound so fragile it pierced through every doubt. Vivian moved toward her again, her eyes sharp with contempt. "Do you have any idea what that vase cost? More than your mother will ever make scrubbing floors in a year." The girl flinched at the words, shrinking deeper into the corner, as if trying to disappear into the shadows of the room. And then, as if on cue, Vivian's face changed. She had turned, and her eyes landed on Jonathan standing at the entrance. The transformation was instantaneous. The rage that had twisted her features vanished, replaced by a look of crafted surprise, her mouth parting softly. "Jonathan," she said, her tone suddenly warm, almost sweet. "I didn't hear you come in." Her hand lowered, her posture softened, as though the last 30 seconds had never happened. But Jonathan had seen. He had seen Lana's bruised knee, her trembling shoulders, the terror in her eyes. He had seen his wife, not as the perfect partner she had pretended to be, but as something altogether different. His mind struggled to process the collision of these two Vivians, the elegant woman he had married, and the merciless figure standing before him. And in that moment, one truth crystallized in his chest with icy clarity. The mask had slipped. It had slipped in the worst possible way, and Jonathan realized with a sickening jolt that he had no idea who the woman in his home truly was. The living room fell into a suffocating silence, broken only by the faint drone of the television still playing in the background. A soap opera blared from the screen, a woman shouting at a little girl on camera, her voice shrill and cutting. The sound seemed almost too perfectly timed, echoing the scene Jonathan had just walked into. He stepped further inside, his gaze moving from the broken vase on the floor to the child curled in the corner. "Vivian," he said slowly, his voice low, controlled, "what exactly happened here?" She didn't falter. Her transition into innocence was seamless, as if she had rehearsed this role countless times. "Darling," she began, the words coated in honey, "the girl was playing where she shouldn't. She dropped the Ming vase your mother gave us, and I was just teaching her a lesson in responsibility." She gestured delicately at the shattered porcelain, but Jonathan wasn't looking at the vase. His eyes were on Lana. The little girl's arms wrapped tightly around her knees, her chin pressed against them, refusing to look at anyone. Her small shoulders trembled under the weight of silence. Jonathan felt something stir in his chest. He crouched slightly, trying to meet her eyes. "Lana," he asked softly, "are you hurt?" She didn't answer. Her gaze flickered to Vivian, then immediately dropped back to the floor. The hesitation, the automatic submission, was louder than any words she could have spoken. Jonathan's mind flashed with images. The summer afternoons when Lana had come to the mansion with her mother, always polite, always quiet. Too quiet. He remembered once asking her if she wanted to join him by the pool with his daughter from his first marriage. The girl had smiled faintly but stayed seated on the edge of her chair, her eyes darting toward the doorway where Vivian had just walked past. Another memory surfaced, one he had dismissed at the time. The day he returned from a business trip and found Lana in the garden, wiping leaves off the patio furniture with a rag too big for her small hands. When he asked why she was working instead of playing, she had simply said, "Mrs. Vivian likes it clean." Then she had fallen silent, her tiny fingers tightening around the cloth as if she had said too much. At the time, Jonathan had chalked it up to childish eagerness, an innocent desire to help. But now, with the cut on her knee and the fear in her eyes, those moments reassembled themselves like shards of broken glass, forming a truth he hadn't dared to see. "Vivian," he said, turning back to his wife, "why is she so frightened?" Vivian let out a brittle laugh, tilting her head with practiced elegance. "Frightened? Jonathan, please. Children dramatize. She knows she's in trouble, and like any child she's embarrassed. You're overanalyzing again. You always do that after work." Her words slid off him this time. He had spent years reading body language in boardrooms, watching executives lie with smiles on their faces. And what he saw now in Lana was not embarrassment. It was caution. The cautiousness of someone who had learned that the wrong word, the wrong movement, could have painful consequences. He could almost feel the calculations racing through her small mind. Should she speak? Should she stay quiet? Which choice would keep her safe? "Tell me," Jonathan said gently, his voice cutting through the room, "what really happened?" Lana opened her mouth, then closed it again. Her eyes darted once more to Vivian, who stood tall, her manicured fingers brushing invisible dust off her silk dress, her expression carefully neutral but her gaze sharp, warning. The girl lowered her head and whispered something too soft to hear. Jonathan's stomach turned. It was all there in her posture, in the way she shrank against the corner of the sofa as though she had practiced disappearing into furniture before. He straightened slowly, his chest heavy with realization. This wasn't about a vase. This wasn't about an accident. This was a child who had been trained to avoid blows, a child who knew fear far too well for her age. And for the first time in 3 years, Jonathan Rivers looked at his wife and wondered who exactly he had brought into his home. Jonathan lowered himself slowly until he was eye level with the little girl. The room seemed frozen in time, the hum of the television now a haunting backdrop. Lana clutched her knees tighter, her small fingers white at the knuckles, her breath shallow and uneven. He kept his voice calm, soft, almost a whisper. "Lana, you don't need to be afraid. Just tell me what happened. You can tell me the truth." Her eyes flickered toward Vivian for the briefest second, then back to the floor. She shook her head quickly, as if even answering might trigger something terrible. Jonathan felt a sting in his chest. He shifted his weight, careful not to get too close, giving her space. "It's all right," he said again. "I'm here now." Slowly, painfully, the words began to come. "Mrs. Vivian, she yells at me when Mom goes to the market," Lana whispered, her voice trembling. "She says if I tell anyone, Mom will lose her job. And then we won't have money for food." Her small frame quivered, and her lips pressed tightly together as if she already regretted speaking. Jonathan's jaw tightened. The television erupted suddenly with a woman's voice shouting at a child, the dialogue on screen sharp and cruel. Lana flinched at the sound. That's what it sounds like," she said, pointing weakly toward the TV. "That's how she talks to me when you're not here." Jonathan felt his pulse quicken. "What kind of things does she say?" The question came out gently, but his heart was hammering. Lana bit her lip, her eyes filling with tears. "She says I should remember my place. That people like me should be grateful just to be in a house this big. That if I make trouble, she'll tell everyone my mom is a thief." The words cracked in her throat, spilling into the heavy air. Jonathan's breath caught. The girl's voice carried more weight than any boardroom confrontation he had ever faced. This wasn't just a story. It was the survival language of a child who had learned to navigate cruelty. Lana wiped her nose with the back of her hand, her small shoulders shaking. "She says," her voice faded, almost swallowed by the silence. Jonathan leaned in just slightly, careful, patient. "She says what, Lana?" The girl's mouth opened again, her lips trembling as if the next words carried danger. Her eyes darted once more to Vivian, who stood in the corner of the room like a statue, her mask of sweetness intact but her eyes glinting with silent warning. The tension stretched, every second a battle inside the child's mind. And then, just as the words were about to spill out, the sound of a car engine rolled into the driveway outside. Tires on gravel, the slam of a car door. Lana froze, her eyes wide, her entire body stiffening as though the sound itself was a command to stop. The front gate creaked, the faint jingle of shopping bags brushing together drifted in. Carmen had returned. The moment shattered like glass, leaving the confession dangling unfinished in the air. Jonathan's eyes met Lana's one more time, and he saw it clearly now. This wasn't the nervousness of a child caught in mischief. It was the practiced fear of someone who knew exactly what punishment looked like. And for Jonathan, that realization was more damning than anything she could have said aloud. The sound of the front door opening broke the fragile silence like a blade. Footsteps entered the hallway, steady but weary, the rustle of paper bags brushing against one another. Carmen appeared in the doorway, still in her plain work uniform, arms full of groceries from the market. She stopped almost instantly, her eyes narrowing as she took in the scene. The broken vase glinting on the marble floor, her daughter sitting stiff and pale in the corner, Jonathan standing tense in the middle of the room, and Vivian with her poised smile perfectly in place. Lana's body went rigid the second her mother stepped inside. Her hands clenched tighter, and she avoided her mother's eyes as though even looking might reveal too much. Vivian moved first, her expression sweetening with practiced ease. "Oh Carmen," she said smoothly, her voice honeyed, "your daughter had a little accident." The Ming vase slipped right out of her hands. She let out a light laugh as if to soften the severity. "Fortunately, she's not too badly hurt. Just a scratch." Carmen's grip on the grocery bags tightened, her knuckles widening. Her gaze darted quickly to Lana's knee, where a thin line of blood had already dried against the skin. For a moment, her lips parted, the instinct of a mother pushing against the restraint of an employee. But before she could speak, Vivian's tone sharpened. "We do need to talk, though, about proper supervision when she comes to work with you. Children are curious, but it's your responsibility to keep her from damaging valuable property." The words were delivered like commands, layered with the authority of someone who believed herself untouchable. Carmen closed her mouth, her eyes dropping to the floor. The bags shifted in her arms, a quiet concession. Jonathan noticed every detail, the flicker of fear in Carmen's eyes, the way she swallowed her protest before it could form, the way her daughter mirrored her silence like a rehearsed response. He wondered how many times this very performance had taken place before, without him there to witness it. Vivian turned, her smile aimed now at Jonathan, soft and composed, as though the room were nothing more than a stage for her charm. "You see, darling. Children need discipline. Without it, they'll never learn." But Jonathan's eyes weren't on her. They were on the brief, desperate glance that passed between mother and daughter. Carmen's eyes searched her little girl's face, but Lana looked away, her lips pressed tightly together. It was not defiance. It was survival. A silent message seemed to pass between them in that fraction of a second, one of caution and endurance. Jonathan felt the air thicken around him, a suffocating mix of fear and submission that clung to both mother and child like a second skin. It struck him with a force stronger than anger, the realization that this wasn't a sudden moment, but a routine. They had lived like this for years, adjusting, hiding, swallowing words to protect each other. He wanted to break the silence, to demand answers, but Carmen lowered her eyes again, shoulders drawn in, as though the very act of standing there might put her daughter in more danger. Vivian's mask of sweetness never faltered, her hands folded gracefully in front of her. To anyone else, she was the image of composure. But Jonathan had already seen behind that mask, and now he knew with a certainty that chilled him, this was not the first time, and if left unchecked, it would not be the last. Jonathan waited until Carmen had taken Lana into the kitchen before he spoke. His voice was steady, though inside he felt a storm rising. "Vivian," he said, gesturing toward the broken pieces still scattered across the floor, "we need to talk. Now. Just you and me." She tilted her head, her smile perfectly measured. "Of course, dear," she answered, as if she had been expecting this moment. They sat opposite each other in the grand living room, the firelight flickering across Vivian's carefully composed face. Jonathan leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, eyes fixed on her. "What I saw when I walked in was not a misunderstanding. You kicked an 8-year-old child. You spoke to her with hatred. I need you to tell me why." For a moment her mask slipped, just slightly. Then she smoothed her dress, took a deep breath, and let out a practiced sigh. "Jonathan, you're exaggerating. Children like Lana need discipline. Without it, they grow wild, thinking they're equal to everyone else. Someone has to teach them their place." Her tone was calm, almost bored, as though she were explaining something obvious to a stubborn child. Jonathan blinked, stunned by the casual cruelty in her words. "Their place," he repeated. Vivian nodded, her voice gaining a sharper edge. "Yes. Let's not pretend the world is fair. Children from families like Carmen's don't have the same future as ours. It's cruel to let them believe otherwise. Better they learn humility early than chase dreams they can never reach." Jonathan felt the air drain from his lungs. He had heard investors speak of competition in brutal terms, had listened to rivals talk of cutting losses without a hint of emotion. But hearing his wife talk this way about a child she saw every day, about a girl who had done nothing but try to help her mother, struck him like a blow. He struggled to find words. Vivian leaned back, her eyes gleaming with a cold conviction. "You don't understand, Jonathan. These children must learn to bow their heads. A black girl who grows up thinking she's equal will only find heartbreak later. I'm preparing her for reality. You should be thanking me." Jonathan's stomach turned. The words felt like poison, seeping into the walls of the home he thought he knew. He stared at her, searching for the woman he had married, the woman who had smiled at his colleagues, who had stood by his side at charity galas, who had whispered loving words in the quiet of their bedroom. But all he saw now was a stranger wearing her face. She continued, her tone sharper now, more defensive. "You work 14 hours a day building your empire. You're hardly ever home. Do you think you're in a position to question how I manage this house? I keep order here. I set standards. And yes, sometimes that requires being firm." Jonathan shook his head slowly, disbelief clouding his thoughts. "Firm," he said quietly. "Vivian, you terrorized a child. You threatened her with her mother's livelihood. That isn't firmness. That's cruelty." For the first time, Vivian's composure cracked. Her eyes flashed with anger. "Cruelty. Don't be naive. Someone has to maintain the difference between families like ours and families like hers. If I don't remind them, they'll start thinking they belong here as equals. And they don't. The silence that followed was suffocating. Jonathan's heart pounded, his mind reeling. He remembered every smile, every elegant gesture, every whispered word from the last 3 years. They replayed now like scenes from a theater production, each one stripped of sincerity. He had not married a partner. He had married a performance. A carefully constructed role played flawlessly until the curtain slipped tonight. He leaned back in his chair, his eyes never leaving hers. "Who are you, Vivian?" he asked quietly, his voice almost breaking. She smirked faintly, her confidence unshaken. "I'm the woman who keeps this household running. The one willing to do what you're too soft to do. Without me, this place would fall apart." Jonathan felt a chill run through him. The woman across from him was no longer his wife in his eyes. She was a stranger, and a dangerous one at that. For the first time, he saw her not as his partner but as someone he would have to protect others from. The kitchen was dimly lit, the soft hum of the refrigerator the only sound until Jonathan closed the door behind him. Carmen sat at the wooden table, her daughter pressed close to her side, both of them tense, their eyes fixed on him as if waiting for a verdict. From the hallway came the faint but steady rhythm of Vivian's heels against the marble, pacing, circling, a reminder that the walls of this house had ears. Jonathan lowered his voice. "Tell me the truth. What has been happening when I'm not here?" Carmen's hands twisted the edge of her apron, her voice trembling. "Mr. Jonathan, please, it's better if we don't speak of this. Mrs. Vivian made it very clear, if I ever cause trouble, she'll ruin us." Her eyes dropped to the table, but Lana gripped her mother's hand tightly and spoke, her voice small but sharp with urgency. "She hides things," the girl whispered. "She takes jewelry, bracelets, and puts them in our bags. Then she says if anyone finds them, we'll be called thieves." Carmen closed her eyes, the shame heavy in her silence. Jonathan felt his chest tighten, anger pulsing under his skin. "She actually planted evidence against you?" he asked. Carmen nodded quickly, her words tumbling out. "The first month after you married her, she showed me a gold bracelet, said she could place it in my cleaning cart if she wanted. She said no one would believe me, not against her word. So I stayed quiet. I couldn't risk it. It's just me and Lana. Without this job we have nothing." Jonathan clenched his fists, forcing himself to keep his tone steady. "How long has this been going on?" Carmen's lips trembled. 3 years, she said finally. Lana's eyes shone with tears, but her voice carried a determination far older than her age. "She says girls like me should be grateful. That we'll never be the same as other children. She tells me not to forget my place." The words echoed in Jonathan's mind, cruel reminders of the conversation he had just endured in the living room. The pounding of Vivian's heels grew louder for a moment, stopping just outside the kitchen. Carmen's shoulders stiffened, her hand flying to cover her daughter's mouth, the silence in the room tightening like a noose. Then, just as suddenly, the footsteps drifted away again. Jonathan exhaled slowly, realizing he had been holding his breath. He knelt down, his eyes level with Lana's once more. "Listen to me," he said quietly but firmly. "Neither of you will lose your home. Neither of you will be called thieves. I won't let her hurt you anymore." Lana's small hand reached for his sleeve, clinging as if to test the truth of his words. "Can we trust you?" she asked, her voice cracking. Jonathan's throat tightened. He had built companies, negotiated contracts worth millions, but never had a promise carried so much weight. He placed his hand gently over hers. "Yes, you can trust me. I will protect you both. That is my promise." For the first time, a flicker of relief crossed Carmen's face, though it was tempered by fear. She knew the risk of speaking aloud, the cost of defying the woman who controlled their survival. But Jonathan's words planted something fragile in the air, something that had not existed in this house for a very long time: hope. Outside the kitchen door, the sound of Vivian's heels clicked once more against the floor, steady and deliberate, as if she were circling her territory. Carmen and Lana exchanged a glance, their eyes heavy with years of silent endurance. Jonathan saw it too and knew he had to act. The mask Vivian wore was cracking, and for the first time, he had made it clear that he would not allow it to stay hidden. Jonathan sat in his study, the glow of his tablet screen illuminating his face as he adjusted the small recorder on the desk. In the kitchen, Carmen and Lana huddled close, their whispers silenced as he pressed the intercom button so they could hear everything. In the living room, Vivian paced back and forth with her phone to her ear, her voice sharp and cutting, no longer wrapped in sweetness. "Yes, Mother, of course I've kept them in line," she said with a laugh that dripped with cruelty. "Carmen knows better than to test me. I remind her every day what would happen if anyone thought she was stealing. And the girl, oh, the girl trembles just from the sound of my heels. It's almost amusing." Lana's small gasp echoed through the intercom, muffled as Carmen clutched her daughter tightly. Jonathan's jaw tightened, his finger hovering over the record button before he pressed it, capturing every word. Vivian continued, her tone smug. "Jonathan? He has no idea. Too busy with his empire to notice what happens under his roof. That's the thing with men like him. So predictable. So naive. He thinks he's in control, but he doesn't understand how the world really works." She stopped, her voice dropping lower. "If he ever dares to question me, I have years of proof of his so-called temper. A little push here, a story there, and the courts will eat it up. I'll walk away with everything while he's left defending his reputation. Meanwhile, the maid and her brat will be on the street where they belong." Jonathan's chest burned, every word slicing deeper. He glanced at the live stream app open on his tablet, his followers list filled with CEOs, lawyers, and board members. His finger hesitated. Then, as if fate demanded one last spark of arrogance, Vivian let out a cold laugh. "Jonathan is too soft. Too sentimental. He actually thinks he can play savior. He'll learn soon enough. He's just too naive to see it yet. Jonathan, dear, you're far too easy to fool." Her laughter rang through the air, sharp and mocking. Jonathan pressed a button, and the live broadcast went out. Instantly, the recording streamed to thousands. Comments began to scroll across the screen, reactions of shock, outrage, disbelief. In the kitchen, Carmen covered her mouth, eyes wide, while Lana clutched the edge of her mother's sleeve, whispering, "She's not hiding anymore." Vivian continued her tirade, oblivious. "Do you know the funniest part?" she said, her voice dripping with pride. "That little girl fears me so much she would never dream of speaking up. That's the power of control. You don't need chains when fear does the work for you. It's how the world has always worked. Some of us rule, the rest obey." Jonathan stepped into the living room, tablet in hand, the live comments flashing brightly on the screen. His presence made her pause, her eyes narrowing, but she still smiled, certain of her power. "Jonathan," she said with a smirk, "you didn't think I'd let you ruin what I've built here, did you? You're clever in business, but here, in this house, you're hopeless. You'll never understand what it takes to keep order. You're too soft." She laughed again, a cruel, cutting sound. "Jonathan, you're far too naive." He held up the tablet, turning the screen toward her. The number of viewers climbed past 3,000, comments exploding in real time. "Vivian," he said calmly, "it seems the world is listening." Her face drained of color as the reality sank in. For the first time, the mask slipped completely. She wasn't just exposed to him now. She was exposed to everyone. The performance was over, and the audience was far larger than she could ever control. The living room no longer felt like a sanctuary of wealth and status. It had become something else entirely, a courtroom without robes or gavels, where the jury was thousands of strangers watching in real time. Jonathan stood firm, tablet in hand, the live feed glowing with a steady flood of comments. Carmen and Lana sat quietly near the doorway, their faces tense but no longer silent. On the coffee table, Vivian's phone buzzed endlessly, notifications piling up one after another, each one chipping away at the empire she thought she had built. Diana Rodriguez, the civil rights lawyer Jonathan had called earlier, arrived with 2 investigators. She moved with the calm precision of someone who had seen cases like this before. She flashed her credentials, placed a small recorder on the table, and looked Vivian directly in the eye. "You should know, Mrs. Ashford, what you just said is admissible evidence. Psychological abuse, intimidation based on race, conspiracy to commit fraud. It's all here, in your own words." Vivian's voice cracked as she tried to regain her composure. "You're twisting this, you're all twisting this. Jonathan, tell them. I was just trying to keep order." Jonathan didn't answer. He held the tablet higher. The number of viewers now crossed 7,000. Comments scrolled so fast he could barely read them. Outrage. Disbelief. Condemnation. Among them, familiar names, executives, philanthropists, colleagues. The very world Vivian had courted for years was turning against her in real time. Diana's phone vibrated. She glanced down and smirked. "The Malibu Country Club has revoked your membership. The Hamilton Foundation has suspended your volunteer role. 3 different charities have removed your name from their boards. And it's only been 20 minutes. Vivian staggered back, collapsing into an armchair, her face pale. Her mask was gone now, replaced by the hollow stare of someone watching her world unravel piece by piece. Carmen reached for her daughter's hand, and Lana, for the first time, looked directly at Vivian without flinching. Her small voice rang clear across the room. "Mr. Jonathan told me bullies are only strong when no one is watching. You're not strong anymore." The words seemed to hang in the air, cutting deeper than any legal threat could. Jonathan stepped closer, his voice calm, controlled, echoing the child's truth. "She's right. Bullies only thrive in the dark. Tonight, the whole world is watching. And now they know who you really are." The tablet buzzed again, another flood of comments, this time messages of support for Jonathan, messages of compassion for Carmen and Lana. Business contacts pledging to back him, others swearing to cut ties with Vivian permanently. The mansion, once ruled by Vivian's cruelty behind closed doors, had become the stage of her downfall. Jonathan turned off the stream. Silence filled the room, but it was no longer oppressive. It was the silence of resolution, of truth finally spoken aloud. Carmen squeezed her daughter's hand, tears slipping down her cheeks, but for the first time they were not tears of fear. Jonathan looked at them and felt the weight of guilt, the years he had been blind, but also the determination to make it right. Vivian sat broken in the chair, her phone still buzzing with the sound of her social world collapsing. No amount of charm or pretense could rebuild what had been destroyed in less than an hour. Lana's words had already become the final verdict, one echoed by thousands. Jonathan let them linger as the chapter closed. Bullies are only strong when no one is watching. Tonight, everyone had seen, and justice had spoken. If you enjoyed this story, let us know in the comments. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring stories.